afternoon, everyone. My name is David Singleton, and I am the Associate Dean for Clinics and Experiential Programs at University of District of Columbia's David A. Clark School of Law. So I am so excited for UDC to kick off its 5th season of Conversations with Clinicians. In the past, we have had illuminating, dynamic discussions, all of which you can access on our website, and a link will be put into the chat where you'll be able to access the previous discussions. If you're new to Conversations with Clinicians, the program features UDC law school clinicians in discussion with leaders in the experiential education field. And as early leaders in clinical legal education at UDC, where our students, every single one of them, has to take between 10 and 14 clinic hours in order to graduate, we developed this series to create the space for clinicians across the country, and indeed even the world, to talk about topics of interest in the field, as well as to explore pressing problems that impact our communities. Today, we are going to explore law school clinic collaborations with Master of Social Work programs. And to lead that conversation is my colleague, Annie Schaufele, who will moderate the discussion. Annie directs the Immigration and Human Rights Clinic at UDC Law School. And we're joined by Roscoe Bright, who is a licensed social worker who graduated from the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work, and Professor Jabeen Adawi, who directs the Family Empowerment and Legal Access Clinic at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. So with that introduction out of the way, Annie, Professor Schaufele, I should say, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us. In these times, particularly in this week, we're all aware of the importance of wellness for ourselves, for our clients, for our students. And this semester, my students have really struggled to find social services support for several clients. Some are on months-long wait lists. Others are cost precluded from services, or there are language access barriers to accessing social workers. And we know that this shortage isn't unique to Washington, D.C. We are encouraged to share that with support from the DC Council, UDC plans to launch an MSW program in 2025. And when we heard that news, we wanted to find a way to bring future MSW students into our clinical program. And so this session was designed to learn from our colleagues from afar at the University of Pittsburgh, where that collaboration has happened, and to learn also from all of you, our audience. And so as Dean Singleton mentioned, our panelists are Professor Jabeen Adawi and MSW graduate and licensed social worker Roscoe Bright. And to start, we wanted to ask you a little bit about who's in the audience. So we've prepared a brief poll, and I'm going to go ahead and launch it now, just to gauge a few questions. Is your clinical program currently hosting an MSW student? If yes, do your MSW students work with the JD students and/or directly with the clinic clients, or with both? Does your clinical program plan or hope, like ours, to host an MSW student in the future? And thank you for completing it. All right, I see some answers coming in, and I'll share those in a moment. Okay, we have at least a few who are already hosting an MSW student. And those who are working both with the JD students as well as the clinic clients. And lots of interest, and so I'll just share this. there's lots of interest for the folks who don't yet host an MSW student to try to explore this model further. And so with that, I'd love to learn a little more about both Roscoe and Professor Adawi's experience. And so Roscoe, tell us about your work with the clinical program at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law last year.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Roscoe Bray. As we said, a licensed social worker. I graduated last year from the University of Pittsburgh. During my last year with the School of Social Work, was given the opportunity to intern with the University of Pittsburgh Law School or the law clinics. Doing a lot of work with a lot of focus on the family law and immigration law. A lot of the focus falling under the social work umbrella. We did a lot of resource connection, but also had the opportunity to kind of hear the cases that the student attorneys and the clinic were working with, and kind of providing a separate perspective. So a perspective maybe that comes from a kind of humanities angle, and understanding maybe some barriers that clients were running into, some situations that some of the clients that are facing and would benefit from kind of like resource connection, some kind of interaction, or even just helping to understand why a client is presenting the way they are. That is kind of becoming a little bit of a barrier in trying to meet the expectations of the court, or maybe causing there was a breakdown at some points with some kind of communication, and it wasn't necessarily like a client seeking to. A lot of it had to do with kind of trauma experiences. So learning and kind of understanding how trauma affects the clients that we are working with, and kind of where we could work with our clients, work with the attorneys to kind of present our clients as the most self-actualized version that they could be, so that they can really work to provide their story to the fullness that they could, for the attorneys to be able to represent them. A lot of our work was done there. A lot of discussions taking place with some very complex case situations coming from both the family side and the immigration law side, and to be able to kind of understand from different perspectives in social work, such as the micro, meso, macro, the person and environment perspective, to really help understand our clients. So we had an opportunity at the clinic to really dive into some of these cases. And I think that our clients were really benefited from being able to have these multiple perspectives and addressing their needs within the court system.
Thanks, Roscoe. And so I'll turn to Professor Adawi. What impact did working with Roscoe have on your clinic, on your students, on yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Anne. So for me, quite candidly, like to have a social worker, student or not, working in a clinic and working side by side with the students was like a dream come true for me, because I'm coming to law from a practice where, in order to best serve a lot of the clients that I've always worked with in public interest or nonprofit organizations, there were so many times where they would have benefited. Both myself, I benefited as a lawyer from having collaborations with social workers, and also the clients have such a huge benefit. Like Roscoe was saying, like one part of it is resource connection, but another part of it is developing understanding. And so in our clinic, having Roscoe as a resource was extremely valuable, because not only did he, were we able to co-create a couple of seminars for the students, but then also to be able to talk about how, like, have a resource available for the students, so that if they also needed assistance in kind of processing the heaviness of our work, they had somebody else to talk to. And I think, on a very thematic level, what we really wanted to press upon our students is that, lawyers, we don't work in isolation, right? We don't have to be it all for every single one of our clients, right? And that there's a huge benefit in being able to collaborate with other professions. And specifically when we're working with clients who are in such high trauma situations or facing a variety of barriers to even engaging with the legal system, how much more value they can get from the legal system if they have other additional support as well. And so I think it really hit home for a lot of students that, an attorney doesn't have to do it all alone, right? Here's the value that you're going to bring to your lawyering to have an interdisciplinary approach. And to be able to break away from this perception that, we as lawyers should be able to learn it all. It's like, no, you know what? I am not an expert in trauma, right? But I do know someone who is, and so let's work together and let's learn from that profession. So I think it was immensely valuable to have Roscoe as a participant in our clinic.
Yeah, and Roscoe, something you said just like piqued my interest, as is often the case whenever I learn from social workers. You talked about kind of the micro, meso, macro approach to social work. Can you tell us a little more about what that means?
Yeah, so the micro, meso, macro approach falls under what social workers termed as the person and environment perspective, which is within our generalist practice as social workers, so kind of like the foundational aspects of social work, we look at clients, whether it be our client being a single individual or maybe like a family system, and we look at them in terms of think of it kind of like as a target, right? So we look at on the micro level kind of what is happening within the client or the identified client. Like, is there mental health, or is there some kind of substance use? Is there some kind of trauma? What is happening within that person that kind of presents them how they, or affects how they present themselves to the world? On a level, that is the interactions that your client is having. So it might be with systems, so such as if your client is a parent and they're working with a school, or like one of their children are in school, that's an interaction that they're having. Maybe it's their workplace, places that they are directly interacting with. And that also includes things like their neighbors, family members, right? Those fall in the meso level. And a lot of times when we think of social work, we will kind of end the thought process as social workers only, like that's as far as social workers work. But we are actually mandated to work on all three levels. The macro level being systems and ideas that affect our clients that maybe they don't interact with on a regular basis, right? But they are affected by. So things like the federal government, right? Your client might never meet someone, a politician or anyone that is making decisions on a macro level, but they are affected in their day-to-day lives by decisions that are made on that level. So when working with the clients, the social workers try to consider things on all three of those levels and try to do interventions on each level where they can, right? So on the macro level, doing things like community organizing and engagement. On a meso level, maybe we are working in, think of kind of like your case managers, your CYF caseworkers, right? A client might be the family, but maybe we're calling the school to try to help organize some problem with an IEP. But also on a micro level, we are working with the client to kind of say like, hey, we can do the therapeutic interventions in the sense of maybe just brief interventions, such as like motivational interviewing to get people moving in a direction. So we have, as social workers, the skills to kind of intervene on all three of those levels, outside of a court system, more of like a community engagement approach. So the person environment is kind of the main perspective that social workers use to assess what's happening with a client and create interventions.
And if I can add on that. It was extremely valuable when Roscoe taught these 3 levels to the students, because then in my ongoing supervision with my students, it offered a framework that they could also think about lawyering on 3 different levels and advocacy on 3 different levels, right? Because sometimes they're often thinking about lawyering as just like about the client, but not only having an understanding was helpful, but also then being able to think creatively about like, what are some other solutions that might help this client, and how can I can provide a lot of value to the client by brainstorming that for them, right? And with them. And so I think that was another way in which we translated and drew interdisciplinary in an interdisciplinary way to support their lawyering.
I think that's really exciting work and ways to collaborate the professions. And I'm thinking about our own clinical round structure, where we go through these stages of rounds, and many of us have started to try to encourage our students to also think about context, cultural difference, and systems. And I'm curious if that mirrors what you were doing in rounds as well as in supervision.
So so we had an interesting scenario where, because we are representing families and some of our families were also involved in CYF, Roscoe was not directly involved in our rounds, but maybe you could speak to, I know you were involved in the immigration clinic rounds, and I think that might be an interesting place to share.
Yeah, so for the rounds with the Immigration Law Center, um, a lot of it was really practicing a couple of different tenets of social work. One being we are within our code of ethics, our MSW code of ethics. One thing that we do is a lot of focus within what we have, or what has been termed as cultural humility, right? The idea that when we are working with clients, we need to, on the micro, meso, macro level, we also need to consider culture, kind of cultural understandings, norms, and how those might conflict with kind of the if we're dealing with different or with Western culture, but we have maybe some kind of conflict with a client's culture, understanding where that is and kind of like how we can navigate those to make sure that that everybody gets what they need to the best that we can. When we were talking rounds, a lot of times I would sit in, I would listen to kind of what it was happening, the kind of story that is developing with clients as they are progressing, maybe sometimes if there's any sticking points, and provide a kind of perspective from kind of an outside view of kind of like, well, kind of how can we help this client, maybe that it would be something that is not maybe regularly done within necessarily like a clinic setting, or like a law clinic setting. I think that the student attorneys in the clinic are fantastic at what they do. And I think that bringing that outside perspective gives them an opportunity to say, oh, like, here's another way that maybe we can overcome this barrier that we are experiencing. So I think that was really exciting for me to be able to kind of collaborate in that sense, because I can tell you, I'm a social worker, I'm a jack of all trades, master of none type, as most social workers are. But to be able to see students that are really honing their craft and really, working on these active cases that are real life, and being able to bring, my understanding of, the humanities piece in to try to overcome barriers that maybe other clinics weren't able to, because the perspective that we bring as social workers is very different in the sense of what we are considering, and really working to get over some of the stickier cases that we ran into. I think was really worth it. Really beneficial to both the client, meeting what they need within their case, and then even afterwards. I think it was all really good, but that experience was something a little different in the sense of navigating kind of what everybody was what our clients were experiencing and kind of progressing in a way that might not be what other clinics may have that don't have the social work involvement.
Yeah, so you've helped describe the work that you were doing, particularly with the family and the immigration clinics. And based on the poll results, I see there's an appetite for probably understanding too the nuts and bolts of bringing on an MSW student. So can you tell us a little about the supervision structure and how this practicum fit into your MSW program?
So for my MSW program, we do a practicum and we do an internship. So my practicum, I was in a program called the Seawell program. It's the Child Welfare Education Leadership Program. So basically, I am a caseworker at my local county agency. And the state has provided funding to allow caseworkers to attend their MSW program, remove themselves from work. But there were some requirements that had to do with one of your either practicum or internship needed to be involved with children. So for my initial practicum, I worked at foster care agency. But for the second one, I said that I want to have a new experience. I need to have an experience with something that is different than what I've done so far. And I've been doing the humanity or the human service song and dance for 10 years. I've worked in, abnormal and significant mental health. I've done direct practice. I've done HUD service coordination. I've done juvenile probation and child welfare. But one place that I'd never really had a focus in or an opportunity to really focus in was things to do with immigration and the intersection between immigration law or really the family in law in the sense of I was always a participant when it came to the court system and families, a participant in the case instead of being kind of that support in the sense of what the Pitt Law Clinic would be able to provide. What I was able to do was understand to the extent possible, and Professor Dr. Sheila is amazing in what she does and how she kind of runs that whole thing. But with me coming into that, there were a lot of moving pieces and things I didn't understand when it came to kind of how immigration law is so different than what we think of when it comes to the court system. And I don't know if all social workers would necessarily be aware of that if they haven't had the experience like I was able to have, and understand kind of like where these this system and the trauma can come from and how significant it can be when your day-to-day is kind of dictated by what can change immediately. It's not necessarily like criminal law, which is pretty standard. There might be changes here and there, but there's like kind of a process. You can see it coming, where immigration, it really seems like drop of a dime could change. And with that big change comes trauma, and that trauma is something that we as social workers need to be aware of and prepare for, and how to support in, as well as advocate for. Within that practicum and being able to have the opportunity and kind of take all that in and kind of engage in that in a learning environment allowed me to better well-round myself and understanding kind of where the concerns were, where the stressors and trigger points could be for clients that are engaged, involved, or could be engaged by a system that I'm not familiar with. So it fit within my practicum in that sense. My supervision was interesting in the sense, so the rounds were a one way of me having kind of that supervision, giving feedback and kind of engaging in what's going on. We also I did weekly meetings with a graduated MSW that was previously at the clinic, and we would kind of talk about cases that were coming in, some areas where, or maybe some case where I was like, I feel like I know something needs to be done. here's my idea, but I don't think it fits. Like, what is your idea? And really shopping that around with another social worker and being able to bring that back to the clinic was a lot of the supervision, as well as, weekly meetings with, people within the clinic. So a lot of supervision being done, a lot of opportunity. And it really fit within, it gave me an opportunity to engage a population that I hope I would engage with at some point and be prepared to if they came to me for help. So a lot of really good work within the clinic, a lot of great learning experiences, and I hope that the clinic feels that, the work that social workers can give back to them is as useful as I hope, I try to make it.
Yeah, and just to name that value, right, of also having someone on the outside who's a trained social worker providing that consultation and supervision. And turning to you, Professor Adawi, again, thinking about the nuts and bolts. There are different models of incorporating MSW students into a clinical program, and some of them depend on whether or not there is that support within the MSW program to provide that outside supervision, or whether the organization or clinic has a licensed social worker on staff. So just based on your experience, what do you recommend in terms of the structure of bringing on an MSW student and the scope of the work that they might be able to take on?
Well, I'm admittedly a little biased because if we could have a social worker in our clinic all the time, that would be my ideal case scenario. Because for me, I just see so much immense value in that specific interdisciplinary partnership, both to the students and to the clients, and to the program, right? And I think as Roscoe was saying, the insight that they get from being in the legal sphere, I think is immense, right? It makes them better social workers. It makes us better lawyers. So it sounds like a win-win. I think the reality is that there's a couple of different ways that you can actually create the partnerships. And I think at a kind of at a beginning level, I think a great way to begin the partnerships is to just do presentations and guest speakers, right? I think that is if we're thinking about this in terms of like different levels of lift, I think that is a really low lift, right? You identify somebody, you start to build those relationships and collaborations with the School of Social Work, if you have one in your university, and bring people in, right? So that they can start to see a little bit more of what the clinic is doing, and simultaneously, like, you can start to build those relationships. I had the benefit of coming to Pitt after Professor Velez Martinez, who is also on this call, had built those relationships already with the School of Social Work. So Roscoe was probably the second MSW student that I had the pleasure of working with and collaborating with. And I think this specific model of creating a field placement program is really valuable, because I think that it gives them it creates the time that the student needs to be physically in the clinic space. So correct me if I'm wrong, Roscoe, but you had also done like office hours. You had time that you were at our clinic suite, and students could come and ask you questions.
Yeah, I try to at least once a week have just kind of an open door, whether it be a student attorney coming in for something that maybe they're experiencing with a case that they're dealing with, or if they have a question about, maybe they're having some problems on a specific case. I try to keep my door open for both, so it's for the well-being of the attorneys and also for the well-being of the clients. So I tried to make sure that we had it open at least once a week, and if not, also have a virtual option and scheduled time throughout the week.
So I think like having some kind of an office hour component is really, really helpful. And I think one thing that maybe we haven't touched on yet is that, I think that especially as clinicians, we're trying to introduce a level of, we're breaking down some of the misconceptions around vulnerability and being able to acknowledge that we have so many different things going on, and that it's not always easy, and we may not always have it put together. And I think that as clinicians, we spend a lot of time with our students to build those relationships, so then we can have some of those challenging conversations with them. And so I think that in the logistically, if you're having this kind of a partnership, having someone who's available to have multiple interactions with the students can be really helpful. So we've highlighted a couple of those, which is like having the social work student involved in rounds, having them come in and do guest speaking, having them do office hours. I think these are all kind of different ways and different levels of lift, right? Depending on what your partnership with the program can support.
And at UDC, this mirrors what we've been trying to do at that first level. And we've been really grateful to have Professor Allen and Professor Galan Cisneros come in and teach two different classes, one at the beginning of the semester on working with trauma survivors, and one later in the semester, it just happened to be this week, great timing, on a class on vicarious or secondary trauma. And on that topic, I'm curious about both the question for you, Roscoe, and then the question for you, Professor Adawi, about how you teach law students about vicarious secondary trauma, and then how you as social work students learn about vicarious or secondary trauma, recognizing again that we do this work and feel an impact on our own lives.
Professor, do you want to go first on this one?
Look, I can let you go first. I feel
Okay.
like I can build on what you say.
Okay. So for the secondary trauma, so we've had I guess the first step is just having an understanding kind of a shared definition of what we're talking about when we say vicarious and secondary trauma is always kind of essential. So the way that we've talked about it is the secondary trauma is kind of this the stress that or they kind of strain that the person that is hearing the story takes on from hearing it. So I wasn't the direct victim of what happened, but hearing the story, kind of playing it out in our heads so that we can understand what's happening, whether it be the attorney hearing the case or hearing the story so that they, during an interview, or it's a social worker that's starting to try to process through or trying to understand what a client has been through so that we can try to do our best to intervene and help, as whatever our job is. We needed to, I think, first have that shared definition of this is what we're talking about when we're hearing this and kind of what is happening. Because as we talk with the social work students, we've all said the same thing, like a client's not coming to you on their best day. They're not coming to you with a positive story, right? Or else they wouldn't be coming to us. The same thing as, the firefighter's not getting called out because the house is doing great. It's because it's on fire, right? The police officer's not being called out because it's a great day. It's because something is going wrong. Attorneys and social workers are kind of the same thing. So we are hearing these stories over and over and over again. And while we haven't directly been subject to the experience, hearing that story over and over and over again does affect our mental well-being as well as our physical if we don't kind of manage that. So the intervention for that secondary trauma kind of comes in two components. Right now, there's work and research that's being done on, first, it's the messaging that we are telling ourselves when it comes to vicarious trauma. Because vicarious trauma would come from hearing the story, but it can also be the reaction that sometimes our clients are going to have to us. You're viewed as a safe person, and it's great if everything's going great. But when a client reacts to us, we can also start to experience that kind of stressor that comes on with that. So the first thing is being able to separate the narrative from or to something along the lines of this is something that there's a reason why this is happening that doesn't have to do with me, right? A client is experiencing something, they're telling me their story, but this isn't, like, reminding myself this isn't my story. Helps to kind of decrease the amount of stress that the brain kind of puts on us on our mental systems, as well as our physical systems. Then the second thing is kind of that self-care component. when we talked about vicarious trauma, and when we were talking about kind of stress in general, we use the example of everybody has essentially a threshold that they can handle, right? Each day we come in with a cup. Think of, a glass of water, a full glass of water. And as the day goes on, as we experience stress, we're taking a sip of that water, sip of that water, sip of the water. And the idea being that at the end of the day, we should have, we're going to have less water than what we started with. We do some self-care, we spend some time with our families, we get good sleep, we refill that glass. The problem comes in when we are not taking care of ourselves. We're not processing through trauma. When I say processing, I mean utilizing, like, if it has to be professional, someone to kind of talk this out with, or self-care to help us make sure our glass doesn't shrink. Then over time it does get smaller. We are able to handle less and less when we're starting to talk about burnout, and the idea of compassion fatigue and things like this. If we are not taking care of the trauma or taking care of ourselves, that glass gets smaller and smaller until eventually you find yourself getting ready to say, I'm leaving the field because my glass is too small. Even when I fill it back up, there's not enough in there, right? There's not enough in there for me to get through the day. I'm running on empty by lunchtime, right? And I know that sometimes for law students, same as social work students, when you start saying self-care at a certain point, people just start throwing their hands up and they're like, we get it, right? But really connecting the importance of it through example is essential to understanding that if you want to remain in the field, if you want to continue to be able to help the people that that was your mission when you came into this, you have to be able to manage that trauma, process that trauma when necessary, have the resources available to you, such as, attorneys having the social worker or their own therapist, the social worker having their own social worker, right? All these things are important if you really want to be able to continue to pursue that mission of, like, kind of, whether it be helping a community, helping your own community, advocating for, kind of making sure that my glass doesn't shrink over the time and I can continue to kind of refill it. So I know it's a long way around kind of getting to this idea of vicarious trauma. It is very complex, but the overarching idea being that as trauma affects us, it does shrink our ability to do what we need to do each day. And the importance of making sure that we are taking care of ourselves so we can continue to not only do our jobs, but be available for our families when we go home, do the things that we like to do when we get away from the field, things like that.
So to add to, I 100% co-sign everything that Roscoe said. And so kind of structurally on the clinical end, a couple of the things that we do actually, the first thing that we do actually starts in their clinical orientation. So we begin to kind of demystify the notion that trauma is limited to these really intense scenarios. And so we have 7 clinics. And so we have the immigration clinic, we have an elder law clinic, we've had a health law clinic, we have a tax clinic, a securities arbitration clinic. And so we have an all clinic orientation that is focused on, like, beginning or at least in the clinical section, or sorry, in the clinical course, beginning conversations around professional identity formation. And so part of that is wellness, right? That's one of the 3 components that we have to talk about. And so what we've started doing is talking about trauma right then and there. Because in as much as we focus on these, like, people are like, oh, if you want to work with people who have trauma, you go to the immigration clinic. But the reality is that we are all in the clinical setting working with individuals who are facing potentially economic trauma or other kinds of traumatic experiences in their life. And even though you may not be interacting with them because of the trauma, it doesn't mean that the trauma is not impacting the way they're showing up in those moments, right? As Roscoe put it, like, they're coming to you on probably not their best day if they're coming to a lawyer. And so the trauma is possibly going to manifest in how they're appearing, and so it helps you understand their behaviors. But I think also it helps start to help give all of the clinical students a framework for understanding how trauma appears also potentially within themselves, or how vicarious or secondary trauma might be appearing in their colleagues. So I think we're often kind of looking at it in a very one-directional way when we're thinking about trauma. And I think introducing these conversations around secondary trauma early on kind of breaks that one-directional thinking. And, you can kind of present a little bit more of a trauma-informed perspective when thinking about your colleagues' behaviors or your own behaviors. So we have those conversations starting at the beginning of their clinical semester or year. And then the other thing that I have been doing in my clinic is I actually have been, I would say in some ways, we have a class on trauma in which we talk about vicarious and secondary trauma, and Roscoe co-teaches it with me. But what I also do is I talk about sustainability in this practice, where we are in a practice where we are helping other people, right? And so how do you continue to show up to be able to help other people? How do you build sustainable practices? How do you address situations where stress does come up? How do you identify the trauma that's coming up for you with a particular experience? In family law, I have a lot of students who say, like, I was a child watching a very messy custody battle for 18, 19 years. Or I have childhood trauma. I'm really concerned about how that's going to come up for me when I'm working on these cases. And so we build that into supervision, where I am having weekly, pretty much set supervision meetings with all of my students. And in those weekly supervision meetings, I make time to check in with them. What is coming up for you? What do you see happening? Why do you think you are reacting the way you are to the clients or to a particular behavior that's happening from maybe your colleague, right? Your colleague's not doing the work that they were agreed to do. And so I have it as a thematic aspect of supervision, so that they can actively build some skills to develop that sustainability. I mean, I've experienced the burnout. I've been in that position a few times already where I'm like, okay, I cannot keep working in this practice anymore. And then you go to a different nonprofit and you're like, okay, it's the same thing again. So I don't want that for my students. So we really use it as a thread.
Thank you all so much for attending. And I'm just going to put in the chat again a link to our conversation with clinicians, where this recording from our program as well as future programs will be posted. And we'll make an effort to post as well the resources that have been so kindly shared in the chat. So thank you to all of you. Take care of yourselves. And thank you to our speakers, Professor Adawi and Roscoe Bright.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.